At midnight on December 9th, the Tanganyikan flag flew for the first time. The next year, the country swore in Julius Nyerere as its first president. He had been elected with more than 98% of the vote. Nyerere set out to slay the three dragons that plagued his country: ignorance, poverty, and disease. His weapon would be socialism, fused with the ancient tribal customs of Africa. The word he used to describe it was ujamaa, Swahili for familyhood.
What my father believed in socialism, the way I understand it, is that right after independence, most Tanzanians were uneducated and were not all that wealthy. So we had to move together.
Rosemary Nyerere was born in the same year her father led the country to independence. She is now a member of parliament herself.
Mwalimu used to say that it's not new because that's how we live. You go to a typical Tanzanian village, a typical African village. We don't have these nuclear families, just the mother and the father and the children. We have lots of people living around. We help each other. So it's not really new.
By 1967, Tanganyika had merged with the island of Zanzibar to become Tanzania. Nyerere had been advocating his brand of African socialism for more than 4 years, but he had not imposed it on the country. He now decided to write it into law. Nyerere laid out his roadmap to socialism in a speech that became known as the Arusha Declaration.
This was a declaration, as it said, not just for Tanzania, but for all of Africa, and indeed other Africans did look upon it that way because it was the most complete, most ambitious attempt to create a kind of communist manifesto for Africa.
Nyerere nationalized the banks and major industries, promising to give workers control of the means of production. And foreign investments would be turned away in the name of self-reliance. According to Nyerere, socialism would now pave the way to true independence.
The declaration, when it came out, spelled out so many things, a certain kind of utopia. There was this feeling that alongside economic development, you created a new human being. It was a whole new idea that talked about caring for the next fellow. That was an exciting period.
Nyerere encouraged Tanzanians to reorganize their communities into collectives he called ujamaa villages. These new villages would build socialism, and they would also provide access to schools, hospitals, and water. Across the harbor from the capital city of Dar es Salaam, Gesalole became an ujamaa village in 1971.
After Mwalimu Nyerere encouraged us to form ujamaa villages, we were the first to respond and make our village an ujamaa village. After we began leading the ujamaa way of life, we were able to get facilities for keeping poultry, fishing. See that boat over there? We didn't have it before. We got it with our own initiative, and we made progress.
Nyerere's vision of African socialism won the admiration of many in the West. As the Cold War intensified, many saw it as the best alternative to Soviet-style communism in the Third World. Support, both moral and financial, poured in.
World Bank presidents would fly out, heads of donor agencies would fly out, students would come to spend a half a year or a year at the University of Dar es Salaam. The University of Dar es Salaam was a great place in the mid-1960s and early 70s. This was seen as a serious, well-reasoned attempt at socialism, and the feeling was, let's support this experiment.
Talk of socialism's potential in the Third World came amid disappointments in Europe. In places like Great Britain, pensions and socialized medicine continued to enjoy broad support. But state planning had not delivered on its promise.
There's a tension between Britain in the 1960s. On the one hand, we have the image of the swinging 60s, the world of the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, the world of Carnaby Street. The problem was that the kind of creative energy that you saw going into music and clothing didn't go into most parts of the British economy.
There was suddenly this color and efflorescence, but what it concealed was the fact that the economy was essentially dying. And we're living on the credit of the past, on old, declining, rusting industries like coal mining, shipbuilding, and steel. And nobody knows where the money's going to come from now on. So it was a kind of fool's paradise.
In 1971, the Times of London called the country's condition the British disease.
The problem with the welfare state was not that it wanted to distribute goods to the people of England. The problem was that a society bent on questions of distribution, bent on questions of consumption, was not a society that was going to deal with the underlying economic problems of how you produce enough, how you produce efficiently, how you compete in a global market. And that's the imbalance.
The world was changing, and it seemed that British industry simply couldn't keep up. Laws designed to protect British workers now prevented management from changing old practices. Workers demanded and won ever higher wages, even as productivity stagnated. In 1975, inflation hit 24%.
What essentially happened was that the wage settlements, as they became higher, pushed inflation higher. And that leads to an inflationary spiral, which was very difficult to control.
Since 1945, Labor and conservative governments alike had preserved Clement Attlee's social welfare programs and most of his nationalizations. But by the mid-1970s, a growing faction within the Conservative Party placed the blame squarely on the legacy of Attlee's government.
In their view, what basically happens in post-war Britain is that socialism, disruptive trade unions, and an expensive welfare state lead to a precipitous political and economic decline. What they see is a welfare state which created a dependency culture. It robbed people of initiative. It robbed people of responsibility. It disrupted the market. It made it impossible for the country to get anything really done.
Among the most outspoken of these conservatives was the party's new leader, Margaret Thatcher.
Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, I presume this is to enable us to sweep Britain clean of socialism.
Mrs. Thatcher just couldn't bear the idea that British decline should be taken for granted. She rejected that with her guts. She thought Britain should be great. Searching around for what was wrong, she decided that what the economy needed was a dynamic shakeout, was to make people self-reliant again, and above all to break the power of the trade union movement.
In the summer of 1978, the Labour Party was in power and gearing up for a new general election.
The Labour government felt that what they really needed was to have a year of very, very low inflation. So they imposed a norm on trade unions, or on all workers, of a 5% increase in wages. In December of that year, the first test of the norm came in a strike or a dispute at Ford Motor Company. And Ford settled for, I believe, about 16%, which was way above a 5% norm. At that moment, the floodgates opened, and all sorts of workers who had pent-up demands for higher wages essentially put those demands to government.
Throughout December 1978 and January 1979, massive strikes shook the country. It would become known as the Winter of Discontent. Most of the striking workers were in the public sector, the nationalized services and industries, truck drivers, teachers, medical workers.
There were stories of ambulance drivers saying things like, yes, we know some people will die if we don't deliver them to the hospital, but we're going to strike anyway. There was a famous strike of grave diggers in Liverpool, which meant that the bodies piled up and were unburied. And there were similar strikes in other public services. Well, this kind of strike really massively erodes public support for strikes, for unions, and for a government that seems completely unable to do anything about it. In December 1978, the Labour government, despite lots of difficulties, still had a lead in the polls over Thatcher and the Conservatives. It was a tiny lead, it was 1 or 2%. By the end of February 1979, less than 3 months later, Thatcher was out in front with a 20% lead.
In Israel, too, socialism was losing some of its appeal. The founders of the kibbutz movement had believed that the communal way of life would embed itself ever more strongly over time. But as the years passed, the trend on the kibbutzim was away from collectivism.
זה התהליך שנמשך למעשה מההתחלה.
If in the beginning we got clothes once a week from the clothing storehouse, then later there were closets, and everyone had their own clothes at home. If at first all the food was in the dining hall, then eventually everyone had an icebox. And then we started to keep things like beverages and fruit inside the house.